Today's video is a question. Can Final Fantasy VII Remake win GOTY or Game of the Year for 2020? Yes, no, or maybe. Before we get into the video, I have beaten a shit ton of games that are ready to review, and I'm not going to mention them all. Just know that Nioh 2 is almost done. Every time I think it's almost done, there's more game to play, more side quests that I just have to do as a gamer. Also, the Final Fantasy XIV patch 5.3 came out. I was consumed with that. I beat the mainline story and most of the new content. However, there's just still so much to do in that game, so I am kind of playing that. So things are kind of on hold. However, I did beat Final Fantasy VII Remake a while ago. Currently playing on hard mode to get all the stuff to be ready for the second installment, which they have talked about. So I figured that this would also be part of a little review that I normally do for the game, as well as asking the question, can it win Game of the Year 2020? Maybe the question is, can a remake or a remaster win Game of the Year? But for now, we're going to run with this. Of course, we're going to look at some reviews, average them all together, come up with our fair grade for Final Fantasy VII. Assassin's Creed Valhalla video did spark some dialogue, especially on Reddit. Don't want people to get confused. If you have a problem with something I'm saying, let's have a dialogue about it. Let's talk about it. Bring up points of your own. The trolls, I love trolls, but I mean, don't you just get tired of being a troll? Anyway. Final Fantasy VII Remake. Is it GOTY?
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.
This will be kind of a mini review, so we're going to move a lot quicker. So let's start off with our favorite resident liars, IGN. A joke, I jest. They're not always liars. Final Fantasy VII is less a remake and more of a complete reinvention. It swaps turn-based combat with exciting real-time action and expands the first leg of the original story by dozens of hours. The issue that Tom Marks is going to have is the filler. And convoluted new plot points. The plot ghosts. I myself have a problem with the plot ghosts. Definitely too much Kingdom Hearts. I've said that before. There is a little bit of filler. There's just too much really slow walking on little ladders that are annoying. It by no means diminishes this rather good game. Dare I say great. Tom Marks ends up giving the game an 8 out of 10, the editor's choice great. Final Fantasy VII Remake's dull filler and convoluted additions can cause it to stumble, but it still breathed exciting new life into a classic while standing out as a great RPG all on its own. And I feel like an 8 is a pretty fair grade in terms of IGN, that's for damn sure. I thought an 8 was appropriate. Now, do they give appropriate scores for all of the games they review? No, they don't. When you look at a game like Naughty Dog's Last of Us Part 2, it just gets a 10 for no reason other than the fact that it's a fucking paid fake review. And then you look at Final Fantasy VII. Well, Final Fantasy VII is hands down a better game than The Last of Us Part 2, so I'm not sure how that 8 really stands up in terms of IGN reviews. But an 8 is fair if we're actually being real about the game. I just wish IGN was real on a more consistent basis. Next up is Games Radar, Final Fantasy VII Remake Review, a loving reimagining of the original that delivers a new experience that's wholly its own by Heather Wald. Games Radar does pros and cons, and the only con in Final Fantasy VII was the lackluster side quests. The pros, impressively detailed, plenty of surprises, looks gorgeous, combat is satisfying, varied, packed with humor. My big pro was like characterization of Cloud that he didn't really have in the original, but they gave it to him with his facial expressions. It was all really, really good. I can't give enough praises to what they did with the character development. The con, the side quests. Now, I remember a con being the side quest in Final Fantasy 15 as well. I get that the characters themselves giving the side quests, I argue, are worse than Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 7, as I really enjoyed the open world aspect of the side quest in Final Fantasy 15 at the very least, whereas the linear nature of the side quests in the remake definitely fell short for me. Like I said, we're moving pretty fast, and they gave the score a 4.5 out of 5. A beautifully crafted and entertaining reimagining of a classic that brings renewed life into its stories and characters. This is a true statement. One of the best parts we'll get to about the Final Fantasy VII Remake is it does something a little bit different and nuanced than most remakes attempt to do. But a 4.5 out of 5 is a super high score. It is damn near perfect on the game's radar scale. Now that is interesting when you look at IGN and they gave it an 8 out of 10. That is a point difference in grades. We can basically have a 1.5 difference of grades. That's kind of like the max limit of, to me, what can be considered a fair grade for a game. If all of the reviewers I'm going to talk about are within about a 1.5 of each other, then therefore that comes down to a difference of opinion. However, they're in the same ballpark. But when you have something like The Last of Us Part 2, where someone gives it a 10 and then someone else is at a 7, that's just an unacceptable difference. Something's going on there with either the person reviewing it, the company reviewing it, and so forth. Do I think the 4.5 is fair? I do think it's fair. It's within the acceptable range. On to one of my favorites in terms of fairness for grading video games, Metacritic. The Metascore was an 87 and the user score an 8.1. I do think both of these are fair, as in they fall within the range. On this channel, we take both of those scores and then we average them together. So cursory is probably going to be around an 84, but let's look at some reviews. Resident gave it a 9. I'm not going to give it a 10 because of the ending. So this is a 9, a great game. That is a fair point. The ending was very different, to say the least. And my biggest criticism of that ending is, how do you make the rest of the journey feel important when about half of the party has already defeated something so grandiose as that final boss from this first game? I don't know how you make the snake on the stake, that's kind of funny, impactful. I'm just not sure how they're gonna do it, but they've kind of proved me at least a little bit wrong with the remake and the videos I had made prior. It was a still very good game. I absolutely loved the original Final Fantasy VII, but one part I hated about it was how absolutely boring it could be at times due to the filler content. The filler content is real in this game. It is because it is so linear. Aldrich gave it a 0. This is for Final Fantasy VII fans. The gameplay is amazing, the world is beautiful and rich, the story might be contentious since it seems to be going in a, I would assume they're gonna say, different direction. I don't know how you can give it a 0 based on the gameplay being amazing and the world being beautiful and rich. Trolls, like I said, don't you get tired of being a troll? Someone we won't be reviewing in the critics, Easy Allies, gave it a 90. Final Fantasy VII is an ambitious retelling and updated systems and story for the modern era. The new battle system is fantastic and does a superb job of blending strategy and action. Additional stories and character moments are appreciated, and the way each character is portrayed is perfect. Some technical aspects could be better, but if future installments maintain this trajectory, we can all rest easy. Now, I don't know what they mean by technical aspects could be better. I think you need to elaborate on that, Easy Allies. What's a review? If we don't got Jason Schreier, he is super well known in the games industry, and this is the Kotaku review. I would be remiss, as well as you, to not include Kotaku and Polygon when you're reviewing a game or looking at the reviews. Just because they don't give a score does not mean that they don't have valuable information, aren't going to give you. In fact, Kotaku and Polygon are two of the places that you can go read a real review of The Last of Us Part 2. You're not going to get that many other places in the mainstream media. So Jason Schreier writes a good piece. Since the game's been out for a while and you've probably heard a lot of it and played it yourself, I'm only going to focus on this one aspect from Jason Schreier. Then I got to the end and realized, without spoiling anything, the game's developers were more or less asking what it means to remake a video game. How faithfully do you have to stick to the script? Just how much, if anything, do creators owe their biggest fans, the ones who have spent so many years begging for a release like this? I think these are great questions to ask and picks up on what I was talking about, the nuance of the Final Fantasy VII Remake and why I'm even asking the question, can FF7 Remake win Game of the Year, right? Normally a remake or remaster can't win Game of the Year. There are many reasons why it can't, but Final Fantasy VII might be the one game that breaks that stigma, because it asks those questions that Jason Schreier so thoughtfully wrote out here, and itself the game plays on itself, especially with those plot ghosts. I heard something interesting. Those plot ghosts are almost like Square Enix's way of literally embodying the fans of Final Fantasy VII Original, putting them into the game. I think those might be a literal representation of hardcore FF7 Original fans, and their transition to coming around in the remake it's just so nuanced. I do have other problems with those plot ghosts, and I will tell that after I get this last review. The final one is Polygon. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a flawed but fascinating reimagining of a classic, a trade-off with the past by Carolyn Pett. The article goes on to say how the original game was ahead of its time, especially with the polygons, and that they're questioning whether or not Final Fantasy VII Remake either captures that crazy moment they were able to do in 1997, or is it just a really good game? Does it meet that high mark? And like I said, we're moving fast, or we're not moving fast. This little segment I thought was important rather than just going through all of it. Remake is wildly uneven, poorly paced, and not entirely successful as a game in its own right. It takes a game that still feels staggeringly ambitious and often turns it into something more traditional, even if every aspect of the experience is so much more technically advanced. I have to totally disagree with this, that it's poorly paced. I do understand that there are basically 2 chapters that just don't really feel good, but the game itself is meant to be slowed down, especially this first part. So I'm not sure why they don't really understand that. The remake is also the best thing a game can be, fascinating. It forces us to confront our subjective tastes and asks us to consider what we value in games when we play. Your feelings about Remake will be determined by what you personally valued in the original release. It's interesting to think that the best thing about a game to this person is that it should be fascinating, and the remake captures that fascination. It's a mirror held in front of each member of the audience. What are your favorite parts of Final Fantasy VII? And did Square Enix enhance those aspects of the game, make them worse, or remove them altogether? Every fan of the original is likely going to have a slightly different answer to both questions. It's better to have these types of conversations. That way, progressive and constructive dialogue can happen, and minds can change, and we can get new insight and thought. The writer here, though, does seem to be a fan of the original way more than the remake, and therefore we would grade it as such. These, however, are still great questions and just reinforce the Jason Schreier idea I had pointed out of the meta narrative here and what you're asking of the audience to consider in a remake, remaster, reimagining, whatever. What do you want out of it? And what is the most optimal? I think the Final Fantasy VII Remake is probably the best remake I've ever played and is out right now. In terms of a remake, it's just a plain fact there, and that's why it's even considered. But as you know, we have to give grades for Kotaku and Polygon. Kotaku, I believe Jason Schreier was definitely on the higher end, and I believe he'd be somewhere between an 8.5 and a 9.5, so we'll just give him a 9, because I really do think he appreciated the nuance that Square Enix was trying to do with the game, so I'm going to give him a 9. As for Polygon, I definitely taste a hint of underlying unhappiness with some aspects of the game being elaborated or elongated in the pacing. So we're going to fall on the lower end, and we're going to probably go with either a 7.5 or an 8.5 as the range. So we're going to stick to that 8 to be fair. So let's do our averages really quick. So let's work out our final grade for Final Fantasy VII Remake. I want you to remember that Metacritic is 2 scores, that 87 and that 8.1. We'll add those together to make sure that we're dividing by 5 for our tally. That equals 168 divided by 2 equals 84. That 4.5 out of 5 on our scale is actually equal to a 90. I'll save us the math there. Then we had an 8 from IGN, which is an 80. we gave Kotaku a 90, and we gave Polygon another 80. Those are our 5 final scores. We'll equal those all together, divide by 5, and our final fair grade for Final Fantasy VII Remake is an 84.8. We will round that up to an 85 flat. I think an 85 is a super fair grade for Final Fantasy VII Remake, excluding my fandom from it, excluding your fandom from it. I do feel like this is an acceptable grade. I don't think the game really is a 9. Why? Because I also want to see improvements to the franchise and the game moving forward, because this is just an installment. I want it to be 3 parts. And why I say 3 parts and people think that's not enough is that I want DLC. I feel like you could tell stories and do things in the DLC very much like you do in an MMO, and we could progress things faster, because I do not want to wait 10 years to play Final Fantasy VII. So I want it in 3 parts. So we go from an 85 to, like a 92, and then we can get our 100 perfect score final, or we go from an 85 to a 90 to a 95. Add in all the DLC, release the perfect edition of Final Fantasy VII of everything, and it's just one game, and that is the perfect 100. I am super happy with that. So let's get to my thoughts. Can Final Fantasy VII Remake win Game of the Year? So which brings me to my biggest problem of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it's kind of a big deal. The trivialized deaths from the plot ghosts. I legitimately, really got emotional when these characters died, or so we thought, and then the plot ghosts, it's implied that they got resurrected them, and then we kind of see at the end of the game the cutscenes to where they're alive, referencing Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge. I'm not sure why they chose this. The also big issue was, why have Sephiroth stab Barrett if you're just gonna have the ghosts save him anyway? I thought that was a really dumb thing to do. So I asked myself a question. So what if they decided not to resurrect those characters? What would those ghosts be accomplishing in terms of the story itself? Now, that's not to say I'm not okay with the changes they made. However, that trivializing, that's a tough little word, of the death really disappointed me. I thought it was going to be meaningful. It ended up not, and that really is why I can't give the game like a higher grade. Final Fantasy VII I thought was an opportunity to show that more grown-up story and hit on those more mature elements, and then they ended up going the, I'll say it, the Kingdom Hearts route, where you're not really dead and you come back at the end. That is actually a really big disappointment of mine. Unfortunately, I don't think an 85 is going to allow Final Fantasy VII Remake to win Game of the Year. Now, I don't put a lot of stock into the review score. However, when I did my Last of Us Part 2 video, a lot of people seemed to bring up the argument that it got 50 perfect review scores, or whatever the number was. So it is very clear that people do put a lot of stock into that. So if we're gonna go off of that, an 85 is not enough. Now, do I personally want it to win? Square Enix is deserved a big win as of late. I feel like they put out quality content. I feel like they don't get the recognition. But again, I have, bashed the video game awards for giving out makeup awards, such as Sekiro winning Game of the Year last year. So I cannot in good conscience say that I wanted to win because of that reason. I would argue that the Final Fantasy VII Remake does not have to win Game of the Year in order to validate that it was a great title of the year 2020. I'm the Grown Kid. I hope you liked the video. Remember, let's have a dialogue. I know I talked a lot. I might have even rambled. Maybe even ranted a little bit. I'll catch you back in another video.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown